I'm Teresa Tam. I will be moderating this panel for Liz, Danny, and Carrie. I am a local Calgarian born and raised um, uh, visual artist. And let's see. I think that's, yeah, I don't know how much more you want me to hear about me. I think I'd much rather spend more time talking about the three other artists. But I'll be the one going through moderation and leading the conversations. Um, but before we do that, though, I want to spend some time going through the land acknowledgement, which I think is really important because we're settlers on Canada, which is a colonial built nation. So I want to make sure we spend time to acknowledge the land. Because this talk and the work that the three artists are working on are about Chinatown, so I'll be addressing Chinatown. So Calgary Chinatown sits on the point of land where the Bow River and Elbow River meet, which it continues to nourish life as it has for many millennia for the peoples of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which contain the Siksika, Piikani, Kainai First Nations, and also the Tsuut'ina First Nation, Stoney Nakoda, which consists of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, Wesley First Nations, and also the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We also acknowledge that the Inuit and many other Indigenous people who make this place their home. This area is known as Mohkinstsis in Blackfoot, Kutsitsuwa in Tsuut'ina, and Winichipa in Stoney Nakoda, which are all names for the Elbow River. These rivers are important sources of life, but for those who know, Chinatown was flooded in 2013. The community gathered to clean up and repair the damage done by the river. So in the 100 plus history of Chinatown, time and again, forces that threaten to bring the demise of the community is halted by the people. Just as the land reminds us of its power to heal and renew, so too do people when they work with each other. Many of our ancestors crossed the Pacific and entered through the unceded territories in the West. All Chinatowns were built by migrants displaced from their homes through colonial forces, who were then granted access to live in so-called Canada by the colonial state. I think it's important to recognize that these forces run parallel to the historical and ongoing colonization of Turtle Island, or also known as Canada. As POC immigrant settlers, we must recognize that our responsibility is to continually build a solidarity with the original peoples of this land. I think to heal from the traumas we and our families experience through displacement and uprooting, we can strive to give back to the land through the teachings of Indigenous peoples who can help us to replant new homes far away from our ancestors. So this was written and rewritten to remember that Calgary Chinatown and all of the panelists here, and myself as well, are guests on stolen land. This acknowledgement continuously changes as time goes on, but I would like to acknowledge Brittany Bearhat, Marina Crane, and Riel Many Wounds for their words and also guidance. And for those who also know, recently in the news, in Southern Interior BC, the buried remains of 215 children was discovered underneath a former residential school. So I would like to ask everyone here for a minute of silence while we reflect on the colonial violence Indigenous communities and people historically and continue to face. So we'll just spend a minute to reflect on that. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for spending time to reflect on that. So I would now like to move on to just a little bit of housekeeping. So for those who are aware or used to Zoom, I'd just like to everyone know that this will be recorded. This is being recorded right now, and it could be potentially be released on a different platform for those who couldn't make it today and who want to view. So if we would ask you to keep your videos off, especially if you don't want to be recorded. And also if you are to ask a question using your audio or your voice, it could also be recorded as well. So feel free to use the chat function if you're feeling uncomfortable, but you still want to communicate with us. Also, secondly, while we're in the panel and talking and presenting, please also keep your mic muted and also your video off. So that way it's easier for viewers to see and find the panelists. So yeah, it's just a bit of housekeeping. With that established, I would like to just quickly go through and describe what the actual panel is before we do the rest of the introduction. So here we have three creatives, Danny, Carrie, and Liz, who are aiming to push through the boundaries that question their culture, heritage, and identity as Asian Canadians. So this virtual exhibition will showcase Yap's Asian-inspired headpieces that are handcrafted with meticulous care and detail, Lai's personal story, growing up on the borders of Chinatown, shared intimately with a familiar face, and Luong's photography, which will provide a visually poetic narrative of our local Chinatown. So I would like to hand it off to the artists to do their self-introduction, and I'll ask Danny to start that off.
Hi, I'm Danny. Mostly everyone in the chat knows me. If you don't know me, I'm the photographer. It's nice to meet you guys virtually. When I'm not photographing, I like to play magic cards and I enjoy listening to techno music, and I like cameras with tendencies to break. That's the best way to probably describe it. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Carrie Yap. I am the Milliner, so the hat maker, and I'm showcasing my work through my brand Yap Sister. In honor of Asian Heritage Month, I also decided to launch my signature looks today. So that's what you're going to be seeing today, and how they integrate with a lot of Danny's photos and Liz's personal story. The importance behind the signature line is it's about showcasing Asian everyday wear that we usually don't see in mainstream fashion. So my line is about really showcasing and connecting and storytelling my journey to reconnect to my Asian heritage. And so I'll be showcasing a little bit about my story and my time in Calgary Chinatown, but also how all those different Asian pieces that I've produced have a place within Calgary Chinatown as well.
So I'm Liz Lai. For the purposes of this event, I'll be the makeup artist as conveniently as well. I will be one of the models in the photos with my niece, Waverly. I have been doing makeup as a freelance artist for the past 8 years. I'm also a Mac makeup artist as well.
Great, great, thank you for introducing yourselves. So for this portion, Danny, Carrie, and Liz will be showcasing a curated exhibition or photographs, which they will walk you through in a couple moments. So each presenter will be going through 4 to 7 pieces in the collection, and we'll start off with Danny, who we'll start with Danny, who with the terrain of like. Danny will start us off with the terrain of the borders shoot, and then Carrie will round it out with her take on the physical and ideological borders that exist in Chinatown, and then Liz will end it off by tying together her own personal experience of living within the borders of Chinatown. So Danny, when you're ready, please go ahead and start your presentation.
Thank you so much, Teresa. All right, if you want to go to the first photograph. So a lot of my work, my personal work, is centered around like the formation of identity in relation to land. I guess what that kind of means to me is like, what does being Canadian mean to me? What does being Vietnamese Canadian mean? What do these things look like? And like, how does being a second generation Canadian inform the way I see things? Next photo, please. I've been photographing Calgary's Chinatown now for several years, and there's something innate there that keeps drawing me back as I continue to grow my work. I constantly find myself being pulled back into Chinatown despite moving further and further away each time. So there's something there for me, and I'm not quite sure what it is. And I've been thinking about it a lot through the course of this work. Next photo, please, Liz. And so going back a little bit, just for some context, my mother and father owned a butcher shop in Chinatown, not far from where this photo was taken. Bits and pieces of my childhood were spent in Chinatown, in the back alleys, running between buildings with my cousins, playing hide and seek or tag. And I remember always like being in those alleyways and looking up at the giant buildings and feeling like really small and inconsequential, but like kind of being like enjoying being in the space. And just like many others, I can't read all of the signs in Chinatown. And yet it's still a place that like reminds me of when I was a child. And I think in a lot of ways, that feeling is part of creating like the concept of what a home is in your head. Next photo, Liz. So while shooting in Chinatown constantly throughout the years, one of the ideas that kept circulating in my head was the concept of borders, what they are, what they do, who they let in, and who they keep out. Does Chinatown have borders was something I was thinking about, and like where would these exist? With this shoot, I had this amazing opportunity to work with Liz and Carrie on this concept and how it would kind of play out visually while telling some of their stories in these spaces. Next photo. And so while I was scouting for the shoot, I focused on trying to find nooks and crannies that were empty. Admittedly, like that wasn't really hard, right? Like currently, as Calgary's pretty empty these days. Still, though, I wanted to look at the spaces that existed just on the fringes of Chinatown and incorporate them in some way. And through the lens, one of my goals has always been to kind of turn the lens inward and kind of showcase who I am through the lens. And often what comes out is something like this, where it's like a mix of cultures, where there's this unique, empty feeling that I feel like it kind of belongs in Calgary, and mixed with like this salt-stained red metalwork of what I presume is a koi fish found in Chinatown. Next photo. And so you can see like I was able to scout these areas and incorporate them into the shoot in ways that I was really, really happy with. And another concept I was playing with in my head while creating this work was like the loss of control, how often we can't control these borders, just like we can't control many different aspects of our lives. For instance, like what people think of us, et cetera, et cetera. And I knew I wanted to use double exposures for this shoot. And so while I was conversing with some friends, I was able to nail down the idea of shooting double exposures as a way of kind of losing control of the final result. Originally, when I was doing this, I had wanted to do a really structured set of double exposures, and I used a notebook to kind of nail down where Waverly and Liz were in each photograph. And I was going to use that as reference material when I went back to shoot it again. But I kind of fell in love with the idea of just letting that go and instead just choosing to double expose haphazardly with like some vague goals in mind rather than aiming for an intended result. And this photograph and some of the work in here is largely reminiscent of that. Go ahead and go to the next photo. And this is also an example of that work. So like a lot of my memories, and this was also a way for me to try and like infuse kind of a bit of my own identity of like a lot of the memories that I have about Chinatown involve like a meat shop and kind of like the grotesqueness and beauty found within that grotesqueness, like that ugliness. So for one of the set of the double exposures, I knew I wanted to shoot in a butcher shop, and I ended up gaining access to one in the Northeast that was an old friend of my mom's. And I think there's a lot of meta commentary that exists within this photograph that's a lot of fun to think about. And I'm really happy with how it turned out. Thank you everyone for your time and your support today and showing up. So really appreciate it. And next up, we have Carrie to talk about her experience with the project.
Thanks, Danny. So I approached this project through my brand Yap Sister, which is a Milliner couture brand that really is about storytelling my journey to reconnect myself back to my culture, my Asian culture. And so kind of going back to what Danny was saying, a lot of it has to do with that Asian Canadian Canadian identity of being, of wondering where you belong. And so my first collection really focused on, it was called Auspicious Expressions, and it focused on storytelling and narrative through embroidery and fashion and putting in narratives into the headpieces. And so the signatures is about really everyday headpieces that Asians wear that don't really get a lot of space within the fashion world. And so I approached it with that lens, but I also wanted to approach it, especially with when I was working with Danny, through the lens of an urban planner. I'm quite involved in China's revitalization period, tomorrow's Chinatown. And so I also kind of questioned as an urban planner, where are the physical boundaries and how are they made? And especially when we talk about Chinatown, and you'll see these reflected in my pieces, Chinatown, while, it's called Chinatown, it has become a place for not only Chinese people, but a variety of Asians and other communities that have also settled into that area and become part of that community. And so in the photos that I picked, I really want to reflect that. So the first photo that you're looking at that's my Percher hat there. And the reason why I picked it is because it really talks about colonialism. It's your classic editorial picture that you would see on an English girl in the countryside, but we put it on Liz's niece, and there's just hidden narratives where we use Asian fabric, and you can't see the detail now, but that's actually a Chinese knot. So it's just kind of like it's a take on what you would normally see in a really colonial kind of normal fashion photography, but you would never see that type of representation in a magazine. So I want to highlight that. Next slide, please. The next one I picked, so the signature is really that little bow, and that was inspired by a 6-year-old young Carrie, but also the Korean dangi. I probably said that wrong, but it's that ribbon that you tie at the bottom of your hair. And the reason why I really like this picture is that it kind of just showcases that little sister, big sister hierarchy. And even though it probably wasn't intentional, it was like looking back on a small young me and being like, oh yeah, that's what you loved wearing in your hair, the little bows. And Liz is like the big me now, and just kind of hugging myself. So the reason why I really love this photography and Danny's photography is because the bow is really the hidden detail. It's really about that family relationship, which is so important, not only to the Asian culture, but to myself. Next one, please. This one is, and the focus should really be on the ribbon. And so that is known as a kian now. And this one talks a lot about kind of that male-female conflict that we have in our Asian culture. So traditionally, this piece is actually worn by the males. And if you ever look in those old Hanfu movies or Kung Fu movies, males usually have those really long hair. And the reason they have that long hair is because it was important. It was symbolic of what your parents gave to you. So your hair was symbolic of what your parents gave to you. And it was very valuable. And so you didn't cut it, you would just decorate it. And so what I really liked about it is that it's a woman wearing this. And so what I love is Waverly's expression, which is, normally as Asian women, we're told to be submissive and to look pretty. And in this photo, Waverly has this look of disgust, which is really the opposite of the idea of a submissive woman. So really like that conflict, but also that it was also a woman, and a young woman that will one day be, very strong, that is wearing this photo, that's wearing this piece in this photo. Next one, please. This is my final one. And so this is where you can kind of see the detail of the percher, but there's a percher, but then beside it is a Vietnamese hat. And the Vietnamese hat was traditionally made out of a towel that you would wrap, then you would braid your hair around, and then that would be kind of the hairstyle. And why I really liked it is because it's kind of two conflicting ideas. It's the oppressed and the oppressor kind of side by side. But I liked that they were looking outside and that they were in a Chinese school, because a lot of my memories of Calgary's Chinatown are being in a Chinese school and being taught Chinese a way that often really didn't work. And I say that because, so often we would be told to memorize 10 words and then, really you memorize the 10 words the day before, and then you take your test like on the Saturday and you'd forget the next week. And so it wasn't really a great way of immersing culture and language into a young child. But I also really like this photo because it's a younger generation looking out into the future of Chinatown, which Calgary's Chinatown is currently undergoing a huge revitalization. And so it's the ability of a younger generation to really have that conversation about, where do our borders lie now? Who do we invite in? What does inclusion mean? What are some central themes that tomorrow's Chinatown really should showcase? And with that, I really want to pass this off to Liz.
Awesome. Thank you, Carrie. Just to let everyone know, I'm just trying to figure out, because I'm doing the slide as well in the back end for this event. But so for my piece, I will start with my photo. So my eyes are a bit flighty. That's the only reason why. So for this one, I just want to begin. I think Danny, Carrie, and I both had equal parts in this collaboration, which is really great. Usually for these kind of shoots, there's someone that's leading it. I think everyone in this group, we all took a really great equal part, and we each have our own story behind it, which is really nice. And I think for myself, bringing to the table, it was my own story. And I think at the very beginning of the project, we really wanted to make sure that we're telling a story and weaving in the importance of family. I think being Asian Canadian, growing up in Canada, family has always been number one, no matter what. And I guess for me, I literally grew up on the borders of Calgary, Chinatown. I ate dim sum with my grandpa, my aunts, my cousins that are in the Zoom chat right now, which is crazy. And on special occasions, we would go back to my grandpa's and we'd play mahjong. I would soon grow up in Chinatown and hanging out with all my friends. We would figure out who can order what food the best way in their second language. And just all these memories were cultivated in Chinatown. And those are the memories. So for the photo shoot, you've seen Waverly, who is my niece. And I guess the photos coming up as well, you'll see Waverly and I, but I guess the story can be interpreted as a current Liz taking a younger Liz, who's portrayed by my niece again, around Chinatown and showing her all these really great memories, but can also be seen as little Liz showing current Liz and reminding her where she's from, where she grew up from, and how she's become the woman that she is. Go next. So for this photo, growing up, I think for a lot of us, we were always told to be a good role model, to be polite, to be humble, and just to be a reflection of the best version of ourselves, no matter what, when we're outside in public. And I think growing up, and even till now, we're always under a microscope. Who's getting, growing up, who's getting the tallest, so-and-so's daughter is so pretty, who's getting the best grades, or who's doing what extracurricular activities. Up until now, even, I've been told in public, like, oh, Liz is wearing her makeup, her eyeliner is so thick, she should just go get double eyelid surgery. And those are normal comments. And should they be normalized? I think that's something to be discussed. But those are the comments that we grow up with, that I've grown up with, that have made me more resilient, and to realize that I love the way I look and to be proud of who I am, and to live life not critiquing others, but to live life focusing on how to better myself, and to be a positive presence for people and others. And I think those are the kind of messages that I also want my nieces and for the future generation to really understand and know about, and to move forward with that. So for this photo, so I think, again, on that note of growing up, always being our best version of ourselves. And that was just what we were taught to do. I think I lived a very privileged and a very fortunate childhood. I'm so grateful for the life that my mom and my dad gave me. I saw how hard they worked as the baby boomers coming from Hong Kong to Canada. And when I was legal enough to work, I got a job. And I knew earning money was going to be hard work. But through working at such a young age and when I could, I also learned that it wasn't always glamorous, that we had to get our hands dirty, and that no matter what position in any organization, that there's a purpose. And no matter how small that task is, that we have to do it to our best ability. And to always follow through. I think that's like the biggest key thing, to always follow through in everything that we're doing. And that's something every generation, I think, should be passed on. That's something that my parents have always really rooted into my mind. And I always say, like, if you're a business owner, you need to know how to keep your washrooms and floors clean. And you should never expect your employees or other people to do that work when you yourself cannot understand what that entitles. And I think that's really big for myself. So this last photo I thought was really interesting. So being Asian Canadian, I didn't go to Chinese school, so I'm not fluent in Cantonese and I can't read or write, but I can speak it. And when Danny took this photo, I didn't know what character was in front of us at that time. So I asked my mom. So that is actually Fong, which is direction. So this is Dongfang Sanchuan, which is Eastern Central Shopping Mall. And this is in Chinatown. So this was really symbolic about growing up. We were always pulled between these Eastern and Western ideologies and just having to step back and forth over these figmented borders. And who should we be? How should we be? Do we stay quiet and humble and work hard with our heads down? Or do we speak up, raise our voices, and make sure that we acknowledge ourselves for our accomplishments? And I think the answer is that it's a little bit of both, and it's part of us and how I was brought up. And I think it's important to always acknowledge both sides because it does make up who we are. And that's all for me.
Thank you to the three of you for sharing your photos, and also more than that, or along with that too, sharing your history and the stories, because I think these are really important. I think for all of us to share, because I think that's how we start to continue to understand ourselves, but also each other, and then build a community. And so we're actually going to be moving into now like the panel discussion and Q&A. But I'll start off with a couple of questions. I mean, I already see there's a question in the chat, but before we go anywhere, speaking about community and connections, I just want like the three of you to actually touch on, how you actually came to know each other. Because I know that, you've been working with each other in different capacities, and, but I think it's really always good to hear how people come together and how they start to work together. Do you want to start off, Danny, seeing as you unmuted yourself?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Of course I do. So I met Liz through my friend Gorman, pretty sure. I don't know when, to be perfectly honest, but sometime just after high school, I want to say, or maybe during. It would be during, and it was this kind of tumultuous phase of being in my 20s, and everything kind of is a blur there now. But yeah, that's definitely when I met Liz. And I remember she was Gorman's best friend. He was always talking about her, and Gorman's one of my best friends, so I'm always talking about him. But that's how I met Liz. And Carrie I met through Liz, pretty sure. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. Yeah, my stories are not too good, but yeah. So I met Carrie through Liz, and that's kind of how the entire project originated, because originally I'd been thinking about like the borders around Chinatown and how to photograph them, and what that might look like on camera. And I'd pitched it to Carrie as well, because she was looking to do a project, because we wanted to do a project together, and then it ended up being the three of us doing the project together. And yeah, that's how I met Liz and Carrie.
Yeah, okay. So I guess my piece, Danny explained how we met. And Danny and I I do makeup for weddings, and Danny would be a photographer, and that's kind of where our paths would cross as well, on that end. With Carrie, when at Mango Mania, when that was happening, Carrie actually came in as a customer wanting to get her wedding catered. So I made her bows and drinks for her wedding. But when we were consulting, I was also like, oh, I'm a makeup artist. She's like, oh, hey, what? I need a makeup artist. You want to be my makeup artist? So for her wedding, I did her makeup and I did her catering. And then afterwards, Karen and I work really well together. I feel like we have a really great energy. And she's like, hey, I'm a milliner. I'm like, what is a milliner? So she showed me all this amazing work that she did. We're like, we should collaborate. We should do these shoots. So I helped her out with her auspicious expressions collection. So I was her makeup artist, and then moving forward for the next project for Revive, which is coming up, we'll be collaborating again as well as Danny. So that's how I know Carrie.
I think they told my story, Teresa. We can.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I also was thinking too, maybe I should also describe how I know the three of you, actually. I was like, so maybe I don't want to insert myself too much, but of course, I was a avid and regular customer of Mango Mania. So I'm pretty sure I met Liz at one point. I also have a Mango Mania hat, so I wonder if you gave that to me. But anyway.
You are one of the few people that would have apparel, but yes.
Told you. But anyway, so with Liz though, yeah, I think this is the first time we're actually like working together professionally. But with like Carrie, I've been on a few panels, especially around Chinatown together, especially with Around Tomorrow's Chinatown panel. And then with Danny, Danny's currently helping me out in my residency with the Calgary Chinatown residency. It's being co-run by the New Gallery in the City of Calgary. So I just thought it'd be good for everyone to also know, like, I'm not just some rando. I mean, I could be some rando, but I'm not just some rando, I like to think. Before we go into some of the questions, there's actually a couple of questions in the chat. I just want to make sure we touch upon, I think, the idea of borders. So the three of you talked a bit about borders on your own end, talking about, whether when you've lived at the edges of Chinatown or thinking about more internally what borders mean. But as we know, though, like borders and map as we know it, such as like lines between nations and like property ownership, these were like the word border and mapping is like very Eurocentric, especially around property. And for those who know, like Chinatown itself is parceled out through like individual and like group ownership, which, in many ways helped to make it so that it's hard for Chinatown to be gentrified or to be overtaken by like more expensive or more powerful forces or more rich forces. So in many ways that's good, but it also plays into like a lot of power struggle as well, as to like who gets to decide what Chinatown is, who it's for, and like where the borders, where the borders start and end, right? Because we all know that like over time Chinatown itself has been chipped away, especially through property, right? So I just wanted to hear like what if you either three of like anyone has anything to say about like like the notion of border, because like borders could also be about personal too. It could be about the body, as Liz you like mentioned in your pieces, and how like the exterior we choose to or are allowed to present is also a type of border, right? That kind of demarcates and delineates who can and what can go past this border. So I just wanted to hear a bit more about a bit broader the terminology of borders.
I can go first. For me, I think I came with this from two perspectives. So one of them is as an urban planner, and one thing when Danny and I first did this project, he was like, "Well, how do borders get made?" And I remember just telling him, like, to be honest, as a planner, what we do is we take a map, and then we find the physical boundaries that make sense, and then we just draw a red line. And so I think that's a really interesting exercise, because when you're on the ground in the community, you feel like those borders have so much more, you think that those borders have so much more thought and process, and there's a reason behind it. But so often it's really like some schmuck like me who was just like, yep, here it is. And it's an exercise, and there isn't actually that much thought. But when we think of like what's in and what's out, and as a person on the ground, there's so much more narrative to it. And I think that's really interesting in Calgary's Chinatown, and not only Calgary's Chinatown, but kind of Chinatowns all over the world, that we do market like what's in. So like all of a sudden one street on Chinatown like is in Chinatown, but the one across the street is not Chinatown. And the one I think most, the one that really comes to mind for me is kind of around the cultural center. You know, to the east of China, of the cultural center is, you know, there is I think it's one of the seniors' homes. And then one block over, it's like an oil company, and like that's out of Chinatown. And like it just loses all sort of presence and feeling of a Chinatown. But if we walk like literally 100 meters, any direction, there's these like red lanterns or these Chinese like garbage cans, and like it feels more like Chinatown. So I always thought that was really interesting, that that feeling of what is in and what is out to be a theme. But also even, and this is my last comment, kind of within the whole Asian community, and I bring this up again, is we often think that Chinatown is only for Chinese people, but so many other cultures and communities, racialized communities, have been in Chinatown, have settled in Chinatown. And this is not really something that only happens in Calgary Chinatown either. Like in LA, there's a little Japanese store right in the middle of it. So it's interesting that we call it Chinatown, and I'm not saying we should, you know, go through a process of renaming it, but we can really reflect that we can be more inclusive.
Yeah, I can follow that up. It's going to be a little bit tough, but I'll try. I guess when I was thinking about, like, when I think about the term borders, one of the big things that I've been thinking about a lot recently is kind of embracing the role of being an outsider. And so if I think of myself as an outsider, I need to be, first of all, outside of something. So I can't be inside, obviously, clearly. So when I'm outside of something, what does it feel like when I'm looking in? And that's kind of what fascinates me about borders, is like when you're outside of them, they look different when you look into them from the outside compared to when you're inside of them and looking out. Right. And so like that's kind of the entire, like that was it for me. It was like I wanted to explore what looking inside of the borders looked like while I felt like I was outside of them.
Awesome. And I guess I think for me, borders, as mentioned, they can be physical, but I think figuratively, borders is kind of what I was focusing on. And again, those cultural borders that I mentioned. But I think borders as well, like being part of the LGBTQT plus community and family, and just trying to see how those borders can be placed side by side and where can that live. And generational borders, like with my nieces and this future generation, educating them, not telling them, but educating them about like what grandpa and grandma did and how hard they worked and what they sacrificed, or how hard they worked, and to give the life that like Auntie Liz, Uncle Simon, Mommy, the life that they have, and just trying to let them see and feel those borders as well, because I think that's really important.
And so actually, there was this one question. We're not going to do, I know it's not in order, but Masood just asked, why is border important? Like, or like, why the border is important? Like, can any of you three answer that question? Like, whether either it's why is it important, or why it exists? Just to contextualize a bit more.
I think it serves as a function. I think borders help us to cognitively put barriers and boundaries, or otherwise it just kind of flows on. But I think at the same time, it can also kind of prevent us from thinking outside the box. And, you know, just kind of talking about what Liz was saying, like, or I think when I've been Danny, like, can we actually expand beyond Chinatown? And I think because there is what we call a border, we think no, but the parcels are owned by individual landowners. So technically, yes.
I think my take on it, I think it is important. And I think on the sense of borders into Chinatown or borders into our culture or religion or heritage, think about it as like acknowledging it. I think pretending or thinking that it's not important doesn't give it justice, just like the borders of acknowledging that there's racism. I think that's a really key one. I think a couple of months ago, one of my colleagues, they asked me, and it's a very comforting, I always say, I always facilitate the safest and most comfortable spaces when I'm talking to people. And a colleague asked me like, hey, Liz, does racism really still exist? And like to talk about that, to cross that border with my colleague and to educate them, explain to them, I think it's very important that we acknowledge it in that sense.
Yeah, I think like borders they're about as important as you make them, right? Like if you don't respect them, like I'm sure there's vagrants and people, transients who don't necessarily respect borders and they don't see borders, and like it's debatable whether or not they exist, right? But I guess that would be my answer is like they're only as important as you make them, right? So that's how I would answer that question.
Thanks, Danny. No, I mean, yeah, I mean, borders are, I mean, also, we don't sometimes even have a choice too, right, in deciding whether borders exist, because sometimes borders also help to protect people, right? Because it's a type of like any other boundaries, it's a type of boundary. So if there is no boundary, then there in many ways too, like it also helps to, it might, not invade, because that's like a really like, I think, really Eurocentric way of thinking about things, but because though we live in a really Eurocentric place too, we have to abide by like the way they think, right? We have to play by their rules of property ownership and borders, even though when really that's like, is that actually like healthier, actually something we want? And I think sometimes we don't get a choice, we kind of have to. But sometimes too, it's like with borders too, we have to be careful about what we compromise, right? Because like whatever we compromise could also eat away at our identities, and like what are we willing to compromise to survive? So I think borders is quite a very like complicated but sometimes necessary, but perhaps something that we could probably revisit and recontextualize, rather as us versus them, but more like, why is it that we have to create borders? And so there was a question directed just to me by Simon, so I'll just read it out. It's kind of a slightly big one. So Simon grew up in a position where they had to compartmentalize, pardon me, their Asianness, really because they ended up hanging out with a bunch of white dudes, which, they still love. But for the three of you, have you ever felt that you've had to put up borders around your cultural self in order to assimilate into your surrounding, whether professionally, socially, or romantically? That was kind of a big one.
Do you want me to go first? Danny, you go first.
Sure, you can go. Okay, all right. I mean, the short answer is yes. And it's like difficult, right? Like I grew up in a lot of the same situation where I grew up in Chestermere, and there wasn't a lot of like surrounding people that I could identify with. There was no one on TV that I identified with, or anything like that. And it's difficult because it's like, I don't know, like obviously like resentment and stuff like that isn't like the correct path to take on those things, or like regretting it. And like each individual one of those pieces is like still fascinatingly like is what makes who you are today regardless. And like how you dealt with that problem also makes who you are today. You know what I mean? So I think it's like it's a really interesting question. And I think like too often we're like focused on like not necessarily resentment or hating the fact that it happened or regretting that it happened, but like wishing that it wasn't so, like wishing that you could grow up in a way that was like, oh, this was, I was surrounded by the culture that I wanted to be surrounded by, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think like, we have, unfortunately, like opportunities grow up in ideal ways like that all the time. So it's about like the growth you have moving forward from that. But the short answer is definitely like yes. I've had to put up borders. I've had to put up walls. I've had to put up barriers, and you know, and this is something that can, like, a lot of people here can obviously like vibe with, is like, you know, like kids would come into my home, they would smell fish sauce and they'd be like, what's that? You know, it smells gross, you know, and like, and then there's like little bits and pieces that like weren't necessarily like designed to offend, you know, like they weren't like the like kids don't say these things to each other out of malice. They just say it because like they don't have a filter, right? And then like it lodges within you, and then you're like, you grow up with this like little chip on your shoulder, you know, and you're like, well, like, should I be ashamed of this? What is this? What is this to me? And I think like it's a really brave question, and it's quite important. And thank you for bringing that up.
I think for me, I definitely put it up. I've definitely had, especially I grew up in Northwest Calgary, and so kind of like Danny, there was very few people of color in any of the schools I went to, and so I do really remember going through school and just kind of rejecting that part of my identity and compartmentalizing it for like, that's at home. And I actually do regret it, because I think part of how Yap Sister actually came about was, it was me being like, man, I don't actually know a whole lot about my culture beyond the food and the language, and I need to learn a lot more. And so this brand, this company I started was really about like, it's actually my storytelling. Like, oh, did you know that like in Asian culture, embroidery has a huge importance in the art we do, and that like peonies have importance, and this is why we put them on our clothes, and like, and that kind of stuff. And so I do remember, just until I was 18, just being like, no, I'm not gonna hang out with any Asians, because I didn't want to be too Asian. And it was a huge regret, because now I missed out on so much great, rich culture. But also, kind of like Danny was saying, I think we've put up with a lot of microaggressions, and I still put up a lot with it with my workforce. You know, I remember bringing up during COVID to a lot of my colleagues about some of the attacks on Asians that were happening worldwide. And I remember one colleague being like, oh, like, is this happening in Calgary? And, you know, just being like, yeah, like, we face microaggressions all the time. You just asking me that, like, do I face racism, is like a form of microaggression. And not that it wasn't coming out of, you know, an air of like sympathy and concern, but I think we have a lot, and that we've compartmentalized and kind of allowed it to happen. And I think that's why it's really important now that we have so much representation and we speak about these topics now, so that the next generation know that, like, you know, this is what inclusion diversity actually means. And this is what, when we talk about Canada being an inclusive, diverse country, what it actually means.
Do you have anything to say, Liz? I mean, you don't have to. You don't have to say anything if you have nothing to say.
I can add a bit. I think to answer that question, I think growing up, absolutely going to school, I was probably two of the Asian kids that were at my school. And I think just really recently, like just what Danny and Carrie have mentioned upon, I've been trying to work on connecting with like makeup and my heritage. What does Liz Line makeup, or what does my makeup really stand for? Who am I as a makeup artist? A Chinese Canadian makeup artist. And I wanted to look into my heritage and my culture. And it was actually the strangest process I've gone through, because I had a huge culture shock. I was approaching my community to learn more about, my focus was Cantonese opera. So the Cantonese Chinese opera makeup, if everyone's not very familiar with it, it's absolutely amazing. And I wanted to learn more about the application, because I connected with that growing up. My mom would be singing Cantonese opera while she was cooking. So when I approached the community, there was this generation gap where I didn't speak Cantonese fluently enough, and I wasn't able to connect with people to actually let them know why I wanted to learn more about this craft. I didn't sing, I didn't dance, I just wanted to learn the art. And there was these weird walls that I was hitting into. Either they didn't know how to share, they didn't want to share, and I wasn't able to learn, to the point where I had to seek out individuals from Edmonton, to teach me, or just to be able to open their doors to teach me more about my own heritage. And I think that's a piece, maybe not that I regret, but that I'm absolutely missing growing up, because I was pulled out of Chinese school to go learn English full time. So I never got to go to Chinese school. So in those ways, yeah.
And I think too, in many ways, like as you said, Liz, like I think other people too, like other, you know, Chinese people, other immigrants, like other Asians, they also put up their own borders, right, in order to keep them safe, right? So like, you know, not sharing with you is like, maybe it's hard for them to share because they're so used to securing that border, right? And so for them, in order to assimilate into Canada, they've had to actually like close off that part of them and make it, you know, sacred in many ways. And I think a lot of people, I think, really had to do that in order to assimilate. So so thanks for bringing that up. Also, we're kind of getting close to our designated time, but there's a few questions actually that are really interesting. So I think if you have additional questions, we will be sharing emails later, but I want to go through the three that have been posted. And then if you have further questions, please email us and then we can like share. I will do Nixon's last, if that's okay, just because I feel like it's always nice to end off in a more, something a bit more, not positive, but just a bit more about yourselves. Masood, asked another question, which is, you know, does the cultural heritage define the borders, or is it like the new Canadian community and integration and integrating that creates the border, or do you think it's like actually a mix of like all of those things? I can also come back to that question later. Yes, Carrie?
I'm just unmuting because I think it'd be a fun conversation, but I'm still thinking about this one.
Because I feel like in many ways it's both, right? So it's like, because I think not naturally, but just by having a different culture, that already creates like a border, right? It creates a line, because it creates between a this versus that, even if it's not malicious or anything, right? It's like, this culture uses fish sauce a lot, right? But this culture does not. So already there's a difference. And like whenever there's a difference, there's already a type of line being drawn. So just by being, I think there's already a border. But I do think though, you know, coming into a different culture, like especially the Canadian community, and then wanting to integrate, I do think it does create a type of border. But perhaps like to expand a bit more on that question, it's like, do you have any examples of like how there's a specific cultural heritage that you haven't spoken about already that you think has, helped to define a type of border? For example, with Liz, I noticed that in your photos you use like red lipstick quite a lot too, right? And like, do you want to talk a bit about that, and like, if you want?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in relation to the question of the cultural heritage defines the borders and integration, I think everyone is pretty accustomed when Chinese New Year's, red is a lucky color, and it is a bright color. And I think the reason why I chose that color and I gravitated towards it is because of all those reasons. In regards to, is that it, as part of our culture, as part of our heritage, those are kind of the symbols that are nonverbal, that when we see it, we know it, like it's instantaneous. And I think that's kind of where that integration into, again, all these, it can be integrated into all the mediums, this whole photo shoot, and who we are in that sense.
Mm-hmm. And we can also move on to the next question if Danny and Carrie, you don't have an answer right now as well. There's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to answer if you don't have anything. Because we do have like one more question too about Chinatowns. So if that's okay, I can go into that. And then if you do think about it a bit more, you can always come back and answer that. So from Nom, is that how you say your name, I hope? Or Nom, From the perspective as a non-Asian, they've always been fascinated by the similarities and differences of Chinatowns that they've seen in different cities. So have any of you, experienced anything similar or different feelings from other Chinatowns that you have captured in this project? If that makes sense. I could also...
I think maybe that should be directed at Danny, sorry, because you're the one who captured it.
I mean, like, I've definitely taken photographs in different Chinatowns, and I would like agree with the general assessment. Like, and it's awkward, right? Because you don't want to say that like they're all the same, because Asian people all look the same. Then all the Chinatowns look the same. That's like probably a problematic route to follow. But like there are certain things that carry over between Chinatowns that I would say that I would agree about. That, like, sometimes there's definitely always a stinky back alley. You know what I mean? Like, you'll always find one of those. Like, that's a classic staple Chinatown kind of thing, right? It's difficult to kind of put down, but I feel like in a lot of ways, just by like photographing and continuing to photograph Chinatown, I get a look at, like, what's distinctly Western about our Chinatown, and what's distinctly like actually, coming from Chinese architecture in Chinatown. You know what I mean? And so you get to see, like, East Chinatown is so precious because there are these amalgamations that are completely different from like the source material. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's probably where I would answer that.
Like, you could, sorry, Liz.
No, you go first.
You can find similarities because of how immigration patterns work, right? And so where there's conflict, one population leaves and they settle in different places. And so it would make sense that you would find similarities with other Chinatowns. Like, I think from speaking from a point of privilege where I've been able to travel to a lot of different Chinatowns, not only because it's possibly the first thing that your parents want to go to when they visit a different city, is, there's always the bakery, a Cantonese bakery, and there's always a butcher shop, and there's always those clan, what are they called, benevolent societies around. So in a way, it's kind of neat because you get to see how different people have integrated into a space, but also where there's that shared kind of familiar lines. So, like, I could go to a different city in a different Chinatown and hopefully maybe find a Yap association. There's none in Calgary, but maybe somewhere else.
No, that's awesome. I do want to know, I know it's 8 o'clock. As a time check, if people do need to leave, feel free to, but I feel like there's some good discussion going, so we might just go over a couple of minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Nam, I actually really appreciate that question. And I think Danny and Carrie touched on a couple of things, but like the architecture, when you go to Chinatown, the architecture is very similar. Can you notice it? But there's really subtle differences. And I think, as again, immigration patterns, are they coming from Northern China, Southern China? What Chinese are they, or what Asian are they? And that will be reflected. And even if you think about the food, different, if you go into a Chinatown, the food, you might think it's all the same, but there's different spices that they might use because they come from one region. Or if you go to another Chinatown and it's the same food, and it might just taste slightly different, and that's just because of where it came from. And even if you want to think about when I'm talking about Chinese opera, right? If you watch any Chinese opera, it's the same storyline, but you can tell if it's Peking opera, if it's Cantonese opera, or if it's, all these different ones. There's 368 different kind of Chinese operas. Can we tell all of them? Do they all feel similar? Yes, but there's just those tiny, tiny differences depending on where it's from.
Mm-hmm. And I also think too, the ways each Chinatowns also were built was also different too, right? Like, with Victoria's Chinatown being like the first Canadian Chinatown, I imagine that the history there is much different, right? As like the first official enclave, and different across the country. I imagine the Montreal Chinatowns are probably quite different too, having to deal with French as well. So yeah, so I will just, I'm going to try to amalgamate two questions into one, which is all directed to Danny, though. So Anita asked, will you be publishing more photos of this series on social? Which I think we can answer also a bit later. But also there was a question by Nixon about what camera you use. Please keep it short, Danny. Please don't nerd out too much. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'll keep it short. The double exposures were done on 35 millimeter film. The square photos were shot on 6x6 medium format film, and I also used a digital camera. If you want to know the specific cameras for each format, you can feel free to direct message me. But yeah, those were the cameras.
Yeah, and then also Nixon also asked just also another question, but to the three of you, like what I guess we can, and this will be the last question is, what interests you in your respective mediums, like I guess or sparked the interest in it. If you, I mean, I guess you already talked. I mean, actually, the three of you have already touched upon like why, especially with Carrie, your interest in like reestablishing your connection, but with with your Chinese identity. But maybe like maybe talk a bit more about like, was there like a moment, or was it a moment? Was there like a specific moment where you're like, this is the medium I want to use, or was it kind of more of a gradual, gradual interest? Because like sometimes with, especially with art making, there's like maybe in the past you've actually had experience with embroidery, and that it kind of turned into something more, or you've always had interest in makeup, but like what really sparked you to take on these mediums in such an artistic and focused specific way?
I can go first. So for me, first I started picking up the camera as a way to make money because I got a degree from university. It didn't get me a job. And then so I started using a camera because I was like, I need employable skills because I need money. So I need to go do these things. And so I did wedding photography. I did anything that paid me. I was like, let's go. We'll do it. Right. We'll try it all. And slowly, one of the things that I started to really enjoy about photography was like through a series of devastating events that happened in my 20s, I was able to just use the camera as like refuge. Because I realized that like when I was looking through the viewfinder, I didn't have to be like myself anymore. I didn't have to be Danny anymore. I could just be a camera, and a camera didn't necessarily like have feelings. It didn't care that there was no money on the table. It didn't care that I was hungry or whatever. It just like, it only cared that there were these lines and I had to get things in focus or out of focus, whatever. Right. But like that became the sensation, it was like, and then that slowly became quite addictive to me, was just like being able to lift up my eye to the viewfinder and then not having to be myself, but instead just being like a vehicle for this apparatus. Yeah, that's kind of what has brought me along in this path now.
I can go next. I think for me, reflecting on it again, growing up and having monolids and having very Asian features, I think makeup was a way to create, and again, makeup to create those defined structures, and like creating like eyeliner to create almost the like a double eyelid, or making them stand out a bit more. And I think it all came from beauty from the beginning, but now it's evolved. Very soon it evolved into kind of bringing out the beauty within someone. I know every makeup artist will say that, but it's honestly, when I'm working on someone's face, it's a blank canvas, and it's absolutely beautiful. It's absolutely stunning. It's about how I can take my craft and my art to bring that out and make that person feel as confident, and accentuating all of their most beautiful features. And that's kind of where and I think it stemmed from, I was always really interested in art and I loved art. But I think coming from an Asian family, I'm like, my mom and dad always encouraged me to do what I love. But I never took the artist route because of those ideologies. Like, oh, what is makeup? You can't do it as a profession. So I went another route. But it's always been something that I absolutely loved.
I I would say my story is very similar to Liz. Was not encouraged to do art. And so I became an urban planner, which is very unstimulating for the mind creatively. And so I needed a way to work with to be creative. And I've always been good with my hands. So if you're ever looking for someone to fold little things for you, I'm your person. So I was looking a way to express myself through my hands again, and I wanted a very unique medium. And so I took up millinery. And when I was kind of practicing it, a lot of millinery is based out of the British or, Australian kind of culture. And it wasn't something that I resonated with. And so I really wanted something that would resonate with me and other hyphen Canadians like myself. So I really wanted to do really Asian inspired headpieces up that used to be worn. And it was really important to me that I kind of do couture because that was the closest thing it was to traditional craftsmanship. So we didn't, back then we didn't have our aunties and uncles, having huge machines, but they would be sitting there like handcrafting these beautiful pieces by hand. And I love the idea that when I'm doing that, I'm also going through the same narrative and the same stories that they're going through and same emotions.
Yeah, and what a nice way to end this Q&A actually. Working through things the same ways our ancestors or our peers are going through, right? In many ways it's like a type of solidarity, by taking photos, by doing makeup. We're also enacting the same rituals, same stories, right? And in many ways it's also connecting us back to each other. And so with that, I would like to end this panel. So we will be posting a bit more information about where you can see the images. But before that, I would like to thank the organizers, the Asian Heritage Foundation, for hosting Asian Heritage Month, which is ending very soon. But thank you for coming today. And also for the CBC as well as the Cultural Center for opening their doors for the border shoot. So the photos that you saw was taken in the Cultural Center. And so I also want to open up for the three panelists. If you have any last words, please share if you have anything you want to say. Who wants to go?
I can start. I just want to thank everyone that came, family, friends that joined us today. All the support is phenomenal. And that's the reason why we're all here and doing what we love. Danny, Carrie, thank you for letting me be part of the Borders Project. And Teresa, thanks for moderating. You did phenomenal.
Yeah. I just want to also thank everyone for coming. I know it's a Sunday. But also to remember, while it's Asian Heritage Month, and this is the month that we celebrate who we are, it's something that we should be celebrating all year round, and to just be that solidarity with other BIPOC communities.
Yeah, I'd like to thank everyone that came out as well, and my mom and Teresa for moderating. This wouldn't have been possible without all of you guys. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just want to say thank you for the three panelists for creating amazing work and for sharing your thoughts, and also thank you for everyone for sharing this moment with us. And so we will be posting, so actually the exhibit will be on Carrie's and Liz's website, which will be posted right now on the chat. So if you're curious to see it again, there's also Danny's a website to learn more about Danny as well. So please check those out if you want to see the photos again. And you can also, those Instagram handles are also in the chat box as well. So if you want to connect with them as well, ask more questions, please, talk to them there. So I think that's the end of this panel. And thank you again. Thank you for letting me moderate, and it's been great, I think, being here with everyone. So please enjoy the rest of your Sunday evening and enjoy the rest of this month. And I hope everyone continue to support, Asians, beyond this month, and the type of work we do. Thanks, everyone. Take care.